Ben Miller-Callihan, welcome to the Rocky Mountain Writer Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on, and in advance, we appreciate your willingness to come out to Colorado Gold in September and be one of our featured literary agents at the conference and meet with writers.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to do a little traveling and also just kind of get physically surrounded by people as opposed to just on the Zoom screen. Though I have only good things to say about Zoom. As a hearing impaired person, I can pipe the audio right to my hearing aids. I can get closer to people than they probably want me to read lips and all that kind of stuff. So.
Excellent. Well, there you go. That's we hear a lot of trash talking about Zoom and not the advantages for somebody like yourself. So that's great to hear. Yeah, fantastic. So I want to get into your background a little bit, but first I want to just touch on the fact I love the name of your agency, Handspun Literary, and I wonder if you can. I've read the description online, but I'd love to hear you describe it for our folks too. It's a really neat approach.
Sure. Well, all credit, of course, goes to my wife, Courtney, who started the agency and came up with the name. She is herself just a big crafty person. So sewing and knitting and weaving, or well, I guess not weaving, but it's only a matter of time. But she does a lot of stuff with yarn, especially when we lived on the East Coast. Did a lot of spinning wool on like a spinning wheel, but also there's something called a drop spindle, which it's a hand spun, literally, device that takes wool roving and turns it into yarn. But because it's hand woven, it has these, I guess what we're going to call imperfections compared to like a machine knitted or a machine spun yarn. But people who know their yarn really crave that texture that can kind of only be achieved by a person's singular attention that draws attention to kind of their craft and their involvement, their intimacy with the material at hand. So when it came to naming the agency, Courtney, I think very quickly alighted on this idea of wanting to represent stories that themselves felt similarly affected by an individual attention, an individual voice, especially those that we hadn't heard as much from before. So we get hand-spun stories that have those not so much imperfections, but textural distinctions that come from, say, writers with color and writers with disability, writers with identities somewhere along the queer spectrum, and kind of and beyond that, not to kind of like create a box that everything needs to fit in, but to go, oh, I've not heard a story from somebody with this particular condition and didn't really think about how it affects their everyday as well as their desire to get their own like happy ending or happy for now, at least.
Well, that's a great description. It must be a lot of nuance in there in terms of wanting both, professional quality, publishable prose, but also that voice that you don't want to dampen or discourage or turn into formula. You want to keep that authentic voice alive.
Yeah. And which is not to speak ill of the formula that one might start with, because I think everybody's got to start somewhere, and distinguishing between what's formulaic / cliche and what's formulaic tropey in a good way. So employing the expectations of the genre. Like if you're trying to write a romance novel, for example, and one of your main characters dies at the end, well, I hate this phrase on the internet, but you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Just because there are genre expectations that feel formulaic and cliche, but you're like, no, really, that needs to be there. So
Picking up. So my last question about the sort of philosophy of the agency is the tagline "by, for, and about nerds." Is everybody a nerd at heart, or is this really, how do you guys define that?
Well, I guess the last thing I want to do is suggest that we're somehow gatekeepers for that term. Because that kind of at the heart of our agency is we love people who, for lack of a better word, nerd out on whatever it is that they love. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize you could be obsessed with that thing, but how fun. I remember working at a school with a guy who was in charge of risk assessment and stuff that put me to sleep immediately, but the man could talk about recycling policies for far longer than any average human, because he was genuinely excited about it. And I would watch him speak and I'm like, I really appreciate like this enthusiasm that you're bringing to a topic that I literally is throwaway. But so for our nerds, probably a starting place is that very like San Diego Comic-Con kind of place of intellectual properties that we kind of associate with the word nerd, but like comics and that kind of thing. But I don't know if this term will resonate with listeners, but we talk a lot about, at least in the office, about competency porn. For all of that, we're not out there as big porn proponents or anything, but the competency porn is just the joy of watching someone in love with their craft and in love with sharing that craft with others, whether that's This Old House on PBS or somebody who like really, really knows their dragons, that brings no end of joy to us.
That's great. What a great description. That is fantastic. I just instantly got it when you said that.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, that works. And it makes a lot of sense. That's very, very cool. Yeah.
Cool.
So I'd love to hear about your background. I know you've done some teaching. Could you just sort of start, give us a little background? Was reading and writing and books something that was in your world from a very young age?
They were. I grew up in Kentucky, and which is a much maligned state. Sometimes they deserve it, many times they don't. But I grew up in a family that very much prized reading, and my parents were not very invasive or demanding in terms of what I read, with the exception of like kind of watching out that I wasn't checking out Stephen King at age 9 or something. But mostly I could, with a library card, get in there and go anywhere I wanted. So I was a reluctant reader for a while, but then the library card like really started singing to me. And so I found, short stories by, like Raymond Carver, who I would come back around to later and occupy the place upon the shelf that isn't that is respected but not controlling of my interest. And now, of course, we've heard recently that there's some question about like how much of Raymond Carver's stuff was really the result of his relationship with his editor, and his editor doing like a lot to strip that down and create that distinctive voice, and that kind of partnership is something that we would wish upon kind of any writer, so long as their voice is really being, brought forward. But back to me, because the question is about me. No. From about middle school, I kind of hopped back on the reading train, reading lots of suspense, short stories, actiony things, Hardy Boys, adventures, that kind of stuff. Typical what we would have called at the time books for boys. And so which is a label I want to move away from, but gives a good sense of what I was doing at the time.
Right.
But yeah, that my grandfather was a self-published poet. My mom would lull me to sleep by reading Carl Sandburg poems when I was an infant. Like, just the language of poetry has always been there. And books took a break for a while, but have been there since about the middle school years. Going through, one of the things my wife and I bonded over was that we both used to go to the library or go to the bookstore and look at the back of the Cliff Notes to see all the Cliff Notes that they offered on what kind of top or what books, and then use that to create a reading list of stuff we wanted to read for real. So that we kind of knew, well, okay, this is the list of stuff that people are supposed to read. And so we started there. Very traditional sense of what literature was. And that has undergone transformations and expansions, gotten rid of a lot of my capital L literary snobbery along the way, and thank goodness, because there's so many. I mean, it's a genre in and of itself with its own rules, but I'm glad to expand my view to other things.
Right. There's as much good writing and ideas and thinking and analysis of the world today in any genre of fiction as there is in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love it.
Yeah. So did you pursue a education / teaching track right away? What was your thought? Were you going to be a teacher early on, or was that something that came later?
I toyed with being a teacher in undergrad, but kind of left it behind to do some local theater things. This is all back in Kentucky, but never quite felt like that was going to be a full-time thing. And the time-consuming nature of theater work is such that you kind of only have friends in theater because they're the only people with that bizarre schedule. Yeah. Which is great. I mean, like I met a lot of great people that I'm still in touch with, but it wasn't the life I needed. So one of my friends in theater told me that she was going to be going on maternity leave, kind of middle of the school year, and let me know ahead of time so that I could start substitute teaching and get all the paperwork and get a little experience, so that she could convince her boss to let me come in for 6 weeks and take over her high school English and drama classes. And I had a blast. It was a great time. I was pretty sure that was how the direction I was heading. But I took a break from that to move up to New York to be with my now wife, Courtney. and did, office work and paid off student loans and credit cards and all that other stuff that your early 20s might give you as the world's cruelest gift. And then hopped into a 1-year program at NYU to get my master's in English education, which was brutally difficult in terms of the amount of work we did, but so rewarding. But it was very much a kind of 6 a.m. to 11 at night kind of life. Which was, it was, I signed on for it, so I knew what I was doing to some extent. And then I taught in New York for about 4 years ish, and then moved out to San Diego, taught at a private school here, and then, which was great until it wasn't, and new opportunities were arising. There was a lot of transferable skills between teaching English and being a literary agent, which I felt really comfortable with. So yeah, it was a bit of a left turn, but I think I don't know, when I left teaching, I was especially taken with this chance to read a lot more genre fiction than I had been able to. I had worked to kind of sneak in some elements of genre work along the way, in independent reading projects and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's kind of stifling. To have, say, a conversation with colleagues about, I'm blanking on the author, embarrassingly, but The Hate You Give was on the New York Times bestseller list. Just an amazing YA novel. But to sit in a meeting and have people go, yeah, I don't get it.
Yeah.
And then move on. It was like, okay, I can't do too many of these before I'm gonna lose my marbles.
Right. Yeah, The Hate You Give was a fantastic novel. It just, and you can just see how kids would relate to it. It just, it just picks up and never stops. When you jump, it never stops.
Yeah, and I like, that term we throw around, like relatable. Like you don't have to be a young woman of color to get that book. Like, oh, it's not about people who look like me, for example. But who cares? Like, people who look like me have written a whole lot of stories, and we've heard a lot from them. And so to pick up something else that goes, oh my gosh, this is not my experience, but I feel immersed in it in a way that lets me feel like I got a little taste of that world and a sense of how I could narrow or focus my empathy on certain situations or causes or things I want to read up more on. Oh yeah, gosh, I love that book.
Yeah, we could probably talk about what high school English classes need today. That would be a whole nother podcast in terms of how to fix public education and all that. But perhaps being a literary agent was always sort of something that was going to happen. Maybe
so. Yeah.
Can you talk about the move? What prompted the move? Was the agency already formed and built and running in New York and then moved to San Diego? And what prompted that?
Yeah. Let's see. So Courtney didn't actually start the solo agency, the Handspun, until 2016, but we moved out here in 2011. So mostly it was winter that broke us. Neither of us are from New York. I grew up in Kentucky with Seasons. She grew up here in San Diego, and there was one point at which I was taking, like a 10-minute, 15-minute walk to the subway on ice with my kid strapped in a baby carrier and my school bag and my kind of a dangerous center of gravity was not so stable. But yeah, and the snow was flying in my eyes. I'm like, there has to be a better way to do this. And so the retired grandparents in San Diego just really sang a siren song, and we heard it. So Courtney was still working with Sanford J. Greenberger at the time, and so she continued that, but remotely for a while, and then transferred kind of to doing her own work, and by 2016 was ready to really call it a company.
Are potential clients of yours, are they sometimes skeptical of an agency based in San Diego being able to do what's needed to be done to represent them? Are they skeptical, or and if they are, how do you make them less skeptical and more aware that the days of having this all based in New York are gone?
Oh yeah. New York, I think, will remain an incredibly important hub to the publishing industry. But I think maybe a couple years ago, like pre-pandemic, there may have been some hesitancy, but there were already a few agencies established in San Diego, who names escaping me at the moment, but yeah, they had their presence, their specialties. It was more that people were seeking Courtney out to represent like romance and women's fiction primarily, but she has a much broader list than that. But yeah, we haven't had a lot of concern, mostly, but especially now that everyone has had some comfort or well, I guess discomfort, as we were talking about before we started with the Zoom. But I can do those meetings with New York editors far more effectively than like before the pandemic. I took a trip up to New York and stayed in a hotel and set up meetings with editors, and that was a blast, but that was money the agency doesn't really need to spend in the same way as we can now, to be like, oh, let me grab you on a Thursday and you next week sometime, and none of that matters. I don't have to try to squeeze 8 meetings into 2 days, and then hope I got everything recorded in the right places. So
with a $300 hotel room and
it's just awesome. It's not needed. In somewhat of a sad way, because I don't get to the city as much, and I kind of miss aspects of New York, but now we will go. If we go, we'll go mostly for fun, which will be fun.
As you come to Colorado Gold and thinking about, we get a lot of new writers every year at that conference. I think last year, out of a couple 250, maybe 300 people attending, there were 70 new writers, 70 new attendees who've never attended that
That's
conference.
Awesome.
Yeah. So it really is great. And a lot of them have never approached a literary agent in person. Scary stuff.
It is.
What is your recommendation to them? What are your how do you like to be approached?
Okay. Well, I think this is kind of stemming from maybe my teaching and theater background in some ways, that um, there's something in improv called yes and, which
Yep.
is the idea that you're given this prompt that you don't know about. Like, you're just faced with a brand new situation, and the key is just to accept it on whatever terms and then see what you can add to it and build from it. So if, I've had people present to me in virtual meetings. Some had something very scripted, and that's fine. Especially if it's your first time talking to an agent. My job isn't to shoot you down, but maybe you and your writing are not yet ready for representation and publishing, or maybe your path is going to be more non-traditional and doing perhaps self-published work, or really small small press kinds of publishing. So when people want to talk to me, I'm not here to make or break your career so much as tell me about your writing, tell me what you're doing. What are you excited about in your work? How does your work talk with other people who are writing? I guess we'll probably get to some sort of what advice do you have in general, but for people approaching, if you want to rehearse it, great. And if you want to have it written so it's nearby, awesome. Outline, bullet points. I have yet to have a musical number, but sure, okay. Let's see what happens. But yeah, I'll take it. I'll take all of it. It may be that people coming to Colorado Gold might not necessarily have a project they want to pitch, but just want to bend my ear for 10 minutes and tell me about their process, or where they might go next, or just, whatever they're comfortable with.
Yeah. What is the one thing, let's say, if you could wave a wand and have all prospective writers who are about to send a query letter to you, or about to pitch to you at the conference, or walk up to you at the conference, if you could implant a chip in all those writers' head that gave them all knowledge that would help you just make the process much more efficient, what would that kernel of wisdom be?
I think the one that pops into my head the most is, I would love for anyone with a project that they feel is approaching representation, possibly publication, that they have read well and broadly in their category in the last 5 to 10, maybe 15, but 5 to 10 years. Tell me what you've been reading that's similar to what you're doing. And if you tell me that nothing's similar to it, that's just tells me you haven't been reading. It's not that there really is nothing new under the sun so much as, a lot of it boils down to a stranger comes to town or kind of stuff, which is fine. But I have trouble taking a pitch seriously if everything that you're comparing it to was published 50 years ago.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yep. What about expectations on up and coming writers in terms of understanding the process and how much work might still be yet to be needed between submitting and ultimately getting you to get behind it and get out there and find a publisher.
Sure.
Just that expectations about the time it takes.
The publishing timeline can be, and perhaps often is, glacial. It moves steadily, but slowly. You might put a query out, and it could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 10 months before you hear anything. I help sell a middle grade novel that's coming out next year, and that was not smooth sailing from beginning to end. Like we had a great story that eventually was picked up by an editor who helped it become like the best version of itself. But that took some time. It took some time to do some revisions, to present it to like a second round of editors, and something in there caught their eye. And so we collaborated, and it was a big, it becomes, well, it's a hugely collaborative effort, even as the author retained her voice and her ideas and property. But the author I'm working with was super open to ideas like, well, what if the ending takes this turn, or what if we build in this way so that a possible book 2 is around. We're like, yes, we love that idea, that's great. So it can take a really long time, and if it doesn't, I mean, awesome, that's great. But everybody's got their success stories on the internet of like, oh yeah, I submitted it and in 2 weeks it was picked up, and then whatever. I'm like, oh, awesome, it can happen. That is not the norm.
Right.
Yeah.
Give us an idea, just in terms of the volume of queries you're getting daily, weekly, and how many writers are you signing up a month, a year, couple or 3, 4 or 5?
That sounds about right. My list has more room on it than, say, Courtney's list, because I've not been doing this as long, so I'm still actively seeking clients. Courtney's kind of taking them on mostly on referral basis now, but and then we have a brand new agent slash assistant with us who's doing gangbusters in terms of like getting queries into her. I would say that we get anywhere from 15 to 25 queries a day. It varies quite widely. In terms of who's signing what, it depends on what the market's doing. It depends on what shows up on what day. We now have a new, or it's new to us, but we're using a query tracker to, well, keep track of queries more efficiently than we did with our query inbox. But that's helping a lot. Yeah.
And I went through your online form just out of curiosity to kind of, you see, you have the online form, and then you can also just log into the official query tracker and send it in that way. But your online form is really interesting, including the required question, what item would you bring with you on a spaceship? Which of course is what every literary agent needs to know.
We do, because we're all signing up for those rockets to Mars. We put that in there honestly because it's kind of a silly question, and you can go a million directions with it. You can take it super seriously and give us a sense that, oh, okay, it's like you're a pretty practical, buttoned up. Okay, cool. It's also a chance to take a deep breath and realize that there are going to be silly parts of this process, and taking yourself and the process a little less seriously, and without dismissing it. It's just it's good to take a deep breath and laugh a little bit at, honestly, the absurdity of a question like, what would you take on a spaceship? And I kind of like the idea of someone a little stymied to take some time to be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, let me put my head around this new idea and see what happens. So,
all right, Ben, what would you bring on a spaceship?
Nuts. I should have known. I should have known. Well, it's so cliche to say that I would bring some sort of reading device, or the first season of Lost or something. But
Yeah, not the later seasons.
no, did they make later seasons? I'm not aware of that. Yeah, they honestly, it would be reading material. As boring as that answer is, I, unlike my colleagues, actually really like reading on my ebook reader. um that's, I think, kind of less common among hardcore book people, but perhaps that's a generalization. Because I think being on a spaceship would bore me to tears, because it's so big. Unless you're, yeah, anyway. I love reading explorations of space travel, but I'm not signing up for a rocket anytime soon.
Well, this has been great. I assume, even with 3 years now as a literary agent, and you've been around your wife who's been doing it for longer, but I assume at this point you're very happy. Seems like you really enjoy doing what you're doing.
I really do. I really, really do. I get to watch people be creative and find their voice and pitch stuff I've never thought about before. And and I get to talk to people about books with people who are excited to hear about books. It goes back to kind of that nerding out that we talked about. But yeah, I'm tickled pink by my job.
That's great. And the last question as we wrap up is, we always like to pay it forward a little bit and shine a spotlight on one author you just think needs a little more attention, or maybe it's some big author, but you just want to continue to celebrate that person's career. It could be anything, just a book, anything.
I kind of want to do sort of two. One would be a plug for one of our authors who I love his stuff.
Sure.
And I'll background somebody else into this. I think Alexis Halls, who is becoming and has become, depending on kind of your viewpoint, a big name. One of the more recent ones that I read that I loved, even as I'm not really a romance guy, was Boyfriend Material, which is a male rom-com set in the UK. The dialogue, the banter is just superior to so many things I've read. He's having so much fun with it, and there's a sequel out next week. called Husband Material, which I haven't read, but I mean, it's going to be good. Um, I think if I had to point to one author, she's hugely successful, but as a person and as a writer, someone I'm really, really loving right now is Leah Bardugo, who wrote like the Six of Crows, the Shadow and Bone. Netflix adapted and is in the process of adapting more. But I also like her one-offs, things like Ninth House, which is just a very much, I mean, it's college age protagonist, but it's definitely grown-up material, a darker fantasy. But she also works on like characters with disabilities, and I know that she has one herself that she happens to be open about how that affects. But just watching what happened and how she talks about her work being adapted and expanded upon in a really inclusive way that in turn shapes how she includes or describes characters as she writes now. It is just, I love her place in the conversation. I love what she puts out. I'm in Southern California, so I have to say something like I really like her vibe. But yeah, Alexis Hall and Leah Bardugo are singing my song right now.
Fantastic. This has been great. Ben, thank you so much for your time. And thank you again for coming out to Colorado Gold in September, and wish you well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm excited to get out there in person with apparently a lot of new writers, and as well as ones that are a bit more seasoned. I'm excited to hear what everybody has to say.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Ben.
All right, you got it.